You step through the swinging doors, and everything hits at once. A cloud of warm breath, the sour tang of old beer, tobacco smoke threading through sawdust, the sweet, oily promise of something frying in the back. The piano tinkles an off-key bar somewhere near the back. Glasses clink. A man laughs too loudly. The first thing you might expect in a Wild West saloon is whiskey and songs. The second thing, if you're paying attention, is the smell. That smell tells you more about life on the frontier than any wanted poster pinned outside. The food was mostly fuel, not finesse. If you like this kind of deep dive into how people actually lived, hit subscribe. I'll bring you more meals that history forgot. But for now, stick with me through those doors. Let me show you what they really ate at saloons. Picture the place. One long, worn counter with a ledger or two, a row of mismatched stools, a piano pushed into a corner if the town's rich enough, and sawdust piled on the floor to soak up spills and soften the noise of boots. Tables are rough, scarred by knives and whiskey rings. Behind the bar, bottles line shelves, more for display than variety. In many places, the stock is the same rot gut everyone habitually drank. The kitchen is less a separate room and more a stove shoved into the back, a large iron pot or two, a skillet, and the cook, a person who mostly keeps the place from starving. Ordering here is not a leisurely exploration of a printed menu. There is no menu. The barkeep or the cook has what they have. You point, you name a price if it's bartered that day, or you feed a few coins to the man behind the counter. Regulars sit with a kind of ownership. They know where the biscuits hide, which cut of meat might be saved for the gambler who tips well. Newcomers learn quickly to read the room, where the coal heat curls, where the chatter clusters, and which end of the counter to avoid if a fight's about to start. There was an etiquette to eating in a saloon, even if it was rough. Food is often served at the bar or on small tin plates. If you're a stranger, you don't ask what's in the stew. Asking suggests you suspect low-quality ingredients, and suspicion is a charge in a room where reputations and fists are both the currency. Instead, you accept your bowl, you eat, and you swallow whatever pride you have left. If a cook likes you, and cooks have that peculiar kind of power in small towns, you might be offered a crack at the biscuit jar. If not, you smile, pay, and go. This was not gourmet dining. It was fuel and community. Folks came in for a hot plate between shifts at the mine, or a pot of something after a long ride. The saloon fed the town's appetite for warmth, calories, and stories as much as it fed stomachs. Everything that went into a dish was chosen for two traits. It kept, and it kept you going. Beans were the backbone. Commonly reported across frontier towns, beans made the cheap, filling center of many meals. They were cheap to buy in bulk, easy to store, and when soaked and boiled with a bit of salt pork, they turned into something close to a meal that could ride out a week of bad weather or a stretch of low wages. The basic method was simple, stubbornly simple. Beans soaked if possible. If time was tight, they went straight into a pot with water, a chunk of salt pork, and a slow boil kept at the edge of a simmer for hours. In some places, folks swore by throwing in a piece of old bread or a stub of biscuit to thicken. The point was to get protein and calories into the most mouths possible. Salt pork and beans together are a recurring image in frontier writing for a reason. The salt pork, not to be confused with the streaky cured strips that modern diners would recognize as bacon, was a preservation product first and a flavoring second. Heavy salting and sometimes smoking kept the meat edible over months. Salt pork was fatty and robust. When fried, it yielded lard that served as the frontier's cooking oil. That rendered fat went into nearly everything. It sizzled in the skillet and became the base for frying potatoes, was worked into biscuits, and was ladled into beans for richness.
If a cook had a mind for economy, they saved and reused that fat, sometimes until it darkened and tasted like the places it had been. Not hygienic by our standards, certainly, but it was a practical economy in an era when lard was expensive and a fire could be banked up for a long night. The texture of salt pork is its own character note. Left to stew, it becomes soft and salty, the meat dissolving into the pot's broth. If you pan-fry it until the edges curl and the fat crisps, it offers a rare textural triumph, a little crunch, a little salt burst, fundamentally different from the stewed version. Frontier cooks knew both tricks. A good piece of salt pork fried right and spooned over beans or a biscuit could elicit a level of gratitude bordering on religious in men who'd been on the trail for weeks. Beans carried cultural weight too. Stories that circulated in camps and saloons, legend has it, told of fortunes traded and poor bargains made over jars of beans. One frontier tale, often repeated as a quib, claims a man once purchased a horse with a barrel of beans. That's a story the teller uses to riff on the value of staples. Mark it as legend. What is true, more often, is that jars of beans or sacks of them were more valuable than a man's empty pockets. They meant meals for a week, they meant leverage and barter when meat was scarce. Beans were the currency of endurance. And yes, the social jokes. People warn each other with a grin. Eat a bowl of saloon beans and you will clear a trail. Jokes about digestive consequences are part of the folklore because they're honest. Beans provided a lot of protein and energy for little cost, but they also, famously, produced gas. Frontier humor often matched frontier pragmatism. You laughed because what else could you do?
A pot of beans steeps time into flavor. Imagine the pot. Thick iron, rimmed with the memory of 100 old fires, bubbling on a stove. The cook stirs with a ladle that's more scar than tool. When the lid lifts, steam carries a smell of smoke, salt, and something faintly sweet where molasses or a stray onion has caramelized. That smell is saloon soul. If you see a room full of miners or drovers leaning over a steaming tin plate and passing the tobacco or the news, you get how food and talk are braided. The beans give you substance, the gossip gives you community. Salt pork's role extends beyond flavor. Its preservation technique, salting heavily and sometimes smoking, was the frontier answer to the lack of refrigeration. That method allows meat to survive long rides and bad weather. It's a bit of common sense chemistry. Remove moisture, pile on salt, and the microbes that spoil meat are less likely to proliferate quickly. Don't get me wrong, food safety in that era was a fraught subject. Kept didn't mean safe by modern standards. It meant good enough to eat on the trail. Mariners and soldiers used the same trick with salted beef and pork. The frontier adapted those practices because they worked when nothing else did. From the cook's perspective, salt pork was the backbone of kitchen economy. If fat could be had, a cook could make beans sing. A skillet kept the smell of pork in the room, and that smell, to human noses at least, the less pleasant realities of foodstuff provenance. Fat was flavor, and flavor kept customers returning. Bread shows the frontier's compromises. There are two common forms of bread in saloon lore: biscuits and hardtack. Biscuits, flaky, tender, the kind that in modern imagination live in a pat of butter and a church potluck, were prized when they showed up. A fresh biscuit in a saloon was cause for small celebration. Because they required fresh ingredients and some skill to make well, biscuits were rarer in smaller settlements. When a cook pulled off a well-made biscuit, people noticed. Hardtack, on the other hand, is the pragmatic opposite. A dense, rock-like slab of flour and water baked until it lost most of its moisture, hardtack was cheap, portable, and storable almost indefinitely. Soldiers called it tooth dollars, and homesick letters called it flour biscuits. In saloons, hardtack might be offered to a hired hand or sold to a traveler needing something that wouldn't go bad. It wasn't elegant. You either soaked it in coffee to soften, crumbled it into stew, or chewed with the resigned determination of someone who had to eat to keep going.
Biscuits had social value. A cooked biscuit could be an expression of care. A saloon that turned out a good biscuit was a place to befriend. It's worth noting that biscuits varied wildly in quality. A great biscuit required fresh fat, enough kneading to give lift, and a stove steady enough to bake without burning. In many towns, the cook's pride showed less in perfect baking than in improvisation, stretching ingredients, stealthily using saved fat, turning a small amount of wheat into more than it seemed. Then there's the sweet corner of the table. Cornbread slathered with molasses was the frontier's idea of dessert or snack. Molasses was ubiquitous where sugar was scarce. It provided sweetness and calories. Cornbread is also forgiving. It feeds a crowd and doesn't require the delicate touch that pastries do. Pies did appear, but they were rarer and prized. A good pie could mark a holiday or a tavern with a cook who cared for reputation. Cheese and pickled goods, jars of cucumbers or other vegetables preserved in brine or vinegar, showed up as ways to add variety and to preserve summer abundance for grim winter months. People drank coffee like it was water and whiskey like it was conversation. Cowboy coffee was barely an attempt at refinement. Grounds dumped into boiling water, allowed to sink, poured with grit and all into tin cups. Thick, bitter, and hot, it was efficient at getting a man awake and moving. Some rode with insulated pots on saddles so they could pour a cup on demand. Others stole a moment at the bar. Coffee's point was simple: wake up, stay awake, keep going. Whiskey served multiple roles. It lubricated conversation, greased the social wheels, and, in folklore if not in medical instruction, was touted as an antiseptic of sorts. Many frontier drinkers believed a nip of whiskey could steady you against cold and discomfort. And saloons sold both fermented and bootleg liquids of varying clarity and strength. Rotgut is a modern label that captures the range. Some whiskeys were smooth and burnished, others were sharp and suspicious. Moonshine and locally produced spirits were common where commercial supply lines were thin. People drank, haggled, told stories, and occasionally used whiskey to wash a wound or to drown the memory of a bad day. Important to say, that's folklore and practice, not medical advice. Steaks? Only sometimes. Popular imagery has cowboys carving into thick cuts by candlelight. In reality, a good steak was often a luxury. Fresh steaks were available when a town had a butcher with access to fresh beef, when a drover rolled into town, or when someone could afford the extra. More often, protein took the form of preserved meats: jerky, salted buffalo, smoked venison, the jerky-like products that were portable and lasted. Jerky, thin strips dried over smoke or sun, concentrated meat's calories into something that would travel. Salted and dried meats turned up in stews or were served with beans and biscuits. Saloons would sometimes offer more exotic or desperate options. Rabbit and squirrel were common game in many regions. They were what a man could shoot on his way into town.
Stories also mention more unusual meats in certain places. Rattlesnake is a recurring note in frontier cookbooks and lore, prepared sometimes as novelty and sometimes as necessity. Label that usage as commonly reported or anecdotally attested, depending on the source. In any case, tough living bred culinary improvisation. Stew deserves its own chapter because it is both culinary sleight of hand and communal ritual. The big pot was the saloon's equalizer. Into a stew could go the day's catch, a rump of beef or the tenders of venison, and also scraps and less honored things, clippings of meat, a handful of jerky to fortify broth, root vegetables reduced to pulpy compassion. Stew's genius is that it hides provenance. A bowl of stew is forgiving. It smooths out toughness, masks dryness, and uses a long simmer to coax flavor from unlikely parts. For a saloon cook, stew was an act of improvisational alchemy. A ladle of hot stew handed to a hungry man might be unrecognizable in its ingredients, but unmistakable in comfort. Social rules circled stew like a polite fog. You didn't ask, "What's in it?" and you didn't refuse it with a sniff.
Questioning the content was an affront, as if you suspected the cook of robbery against your dignity. The unwritten etiquette bound the community. If the pot simmered, it fed whoever accepted its bowl. There are numerous tales, often framed as legend, of someone finding something in their stew that made them laugh or spit in equal measure. One old story, told with great relish by subsequent generations, describes a miner who found the end of a bootlace in his bowl, prompting shouts and jokes about the mine's cost-cutting. Mark that tale as anecdotal. It's the kind of yarn that circulates to underscore the stew's inscrutable nature. Risk lived in that pot too. Long simmers cut down many pathogens, but the frontier's lack of consistent heat, storage, and sanitation meant that eating out carried a chance of getting sick. People understood that eating at a saloon was participation in a shared risk, the reward being a hot meal and the price being the uncertainty. That negotiation between risk and necessity lies at the heart of frontier food culture. There was also a hierarchy of who got what. The dinner that landed on a table might reflect more than hunger. It reflected social standing. A gambler with a full purse could demand a tender cut and command respect. The honest laborer took the pot. A favored regular might get the first biscuit. The cook, who rules the back room, is the frontier's secret sovereign, grumpy, indispensable, sometimes capricious, always aware of which patrons are worth extra scraps. The cook's domain is worth stepping into, not to pry into every grim detail, but to understand how saloon food arrived at the bar. In many small towns, the cook was a loner, sometimes a woman, sometimes a man, often someone with a temper and a talent for economy. The cook juggled fire, scarce supplies, and a rotating cast of customers who had priorities and paydays that did not align. If you sought neat cleanliness as a given, you'd be disappointed. If you sought resourcefulness, there you'd find it. The cook turned salt pork and beans into something reliable. They patched holes in supplies with pickles and molasses. They smeared fat on a pan until the next batch of biscuits rose. They reserved the best pieces for favored patrons, a quiet and practical form of power. A small aside, sometimes the cook was the town's storyteller in a different register. A cook's kitchen is a place of secrets and small kindnesses. You might see the cook slip an extra piece of meat into a poor man's bowl. You also might see a cook slam a ladle across a back for reasons you do not want to know. These details create texture. The cook is the person who determines what passes for food and the person who knows how to keep people fed between paydays. Let's linger on a few more staples because they tell the story in heft and smell. Cornbread with molasses is both a taste and an argument. It's cheap and fortifying and flexible. You can eat it hot, you can crumble it into a pot, you can smear it with molasses for a sweet edge that is caloric and satisfying. Pickled goods, cucumbers, perhaps beets or onions, were important because pickling preserved flavors and nutrients over months when fresh produce was scarce. A jar of pickles on a counter speaks of summer stored for winter. Cheese shows up as a preserved dairy commodity. A hard cheese kept in a lard of sorts, or smoked cheese, could survive where milk might not. Before we push deeper into stew and the odd meats that sometimes wandered into pots, consider this sensation. You are handed a tin plate. A ladle has just scraped the pot, leaving a rim of broth that glitters in the lamplight. Steam wraps your face like an old blanket. The stew smells of broth, fat, and the faint undertone of whatever meat has been coaxed into tenderness. Someone at the table jokes, someone else spits out a comment about the last fight in town. You put the spoon to your mouth. That spoon carries more than food. It carries news, it carries community, and it carries the frontier's willingness to eat what keeps you alive. Now let me start to tell you about the fringes, the meats that make folks shiver or grin when I mention them. Rabbits and squirrels are ordinary. Men shot them on the way to town and handed them in for stew. Venison and buffalo turned up where landscapes allowed. The buffalo, once the region's dominant protein, could be a luxury when fresh or an economic necessity when dried. Jerky, strips of meat dried by smoke or sun, was a mainstay for travelers and hunters. Salted beef and biltong-like strips of meat functioned like concentrated portable steaks. They had soul and grit, and they could be chewed like experience. Then there are the stories that sit between necessity and showmanship, rattlesnake as novelty fare, for example. Some frontier recipe collections and first-hand accounts mention rattlesnake meat being prepared, sometimes as a curiosity for a celebratory meal, sometimes as something a desperate traveler might eat. Label these as anecdotally attested. They exist in the record as occasional occurrences, not as standard menu items. People in frontier towns displayed ingenuity. If a snake ended in a pot, the reaction could range from practical acceptance to theatrical disgust. Keep in mind, too, that tastes in the 19th century West were regional. A saloon in a cattle town near the plains had different supplies than a mining camp up in the mountains. The menu reflected the local ecology. Where game was plentiful, game found its way into stew. Where cattle were driven through, beef might be fresher and more available. Saloons capitalized on local abundance when they could, and turned to trade goods like salt pork and hardtack when they could not. There's also a moral layer to who ate what. Eating in a saloon was not only nourishment, it was a statement. Were you someone who could afford a steak? Were you someone who accepted the stew gratefully? Did you trade a story for a bowl? The social currency translated into food currency. And then, speaking of stew and oddities, there are those stories that get retold like campfire ghost tales. One old-time anecdote, shared with a wink across generations, tells of a bowl of stew that included an unexpected strand of leather, supposedly the end of a bootlace. The teller always pauses for effect and then throws in a shrug about frontier economies. That's an anecdote, not a citation. It tells us about fear and humor. People laughed about what could go wrong because laughing lessened the edge. Imagine now the cook ladling stew for a tired miner. The miner looks down, lifts steam to his face, blows, and digs in. Around them, other plates pile up. Beans with a flake of salt pork on top. A chunk of cornbread leaning over a puddle of broth. The barkeep slides a shot of whiskey, and it slaps down on the counter with a promise of heat. Conversation shifts between weather and wages. Somewhere, the piano starts in on an old tune. That scene explains why people came to saloons as much for the plate as for the company. I'll stop here in this scene, with the pot still simmering and the cook pulling another tin plate, because there's more to unpack about stew's relationship with identity and economy. Next, I'll take you deeper into the rump and edge cases of frontier protein, the jerky varieties, salted buffalo practice, the rare fresh steak, and I'll show you how the cook's economy made or broke reputations. I'll also get into the specific techniques cooks used to stretch a night's worth of food without making the place unlivable, reuse of fat, pickling practices, and the lines they drew about what could be fed to which patron. But before that, pause and picture this. The ladle lifts, and in its silver curve there is broth that has absorbed a town's worth of weather, work, and gossip. A man takes it, breathes in, and eats. What would you ask him about the pot if you were there? Which saloon item would you dare try first? The beans, the salt pork, or a risky taste of stew? Comment below with your pick, because when we come back, we'll pry into the pot and the pantry and see what else clinks in those tin plates. Now, pry the lid off that pot and let's talk about the kinds of meat that gave saloon grub its backbone and its reputation. If beans were the staple carbohydrate and salt pork the flavor engine, jerky and dried meats were the travel rations that kept a man moving between towns. Picture a string of meat hung from a rafters beam, thin strips of beef or buffalo, darkened by smoke, taut as leather and meant to be gnawed, not cut. Jerky concentrated calories into a small, light package. Hunters and drovers favored it because it survived heat and jostle. A man could strap a bundle to his saddle and ride for days without worrying whether it would sour. The process, in broad strokes, is what you'd expect from necessity. Salt it, hang it, smoke, or sun-dry it. The smoke did more than impart a flavor note, it helped preserve the flesh. Salt drew moisture out. Time and dryness finished the job. The result was often tough. You chewed it as you might chew on a long day's work, but it was dependable. Jerky was both food and story. You'd trade strips at the table as you traded news, and the toughness of a particular batch became someone's calling card. That man's jerky will keep a cow quiet for a week, someone might say, and it was a compliment. Buffalo, when available, turned into several forms. Fresh on the table if the meat had been recently brought in, dried into what early travelers called pemmican-like products, or salted for long journeys. Pemmican, in the strictest sense, is a different, often indigenous formulation. Dried meat pounded with fat and sometimes berries. A compact, high-energy product revered by people who knew exactly how to travel light and feed many. On the plains, buffalo could be both sustenance and trade commodity. Dried buffalo meat was prized for its shelf life and calorie density. In some accounts, frontier cooks used powdered or shredded dried buffalo to thicken stews or to add a smoky, meaty note that could transform a weak broth into something parade-worthy. Fresh steak, that prized image of frontier dining, was episodic. If you were a gambler with coin or a rancher with stock, you might eat a decent cut now and then.
But most towns depended on butchers who received animals in batches when drovers passed through or when local butchering was economical. Meat that looked tender and red on arrival could be quickly reduced to something much tougher if overcooked on a rough stove. The saloon's goal wasn't culinary perfection, it was feeding people who had walked through dust and cold. A steak seared too long became a sacrifice to practicality. Safer perhaps to overcook than to serve something that might quickly go off in the heat. And then there were the odd meats that taste like frontier improvisation. Rabbit and squirrel, of course. Small, quick kills for a passing woodsman. Venison, where deer were plenty. Sometimes, in places where curiosity and showmanship mingled with necessity, you'd hear of rattlesnake being served up as a novelty or a last resort protein. That one sits, for our purposes, in the anecdotally attested column. It appears in some cookbooks and in travelers' stories, but it was not a mainstream, everyday offering. It was as much theater as food. Someone would serve a dish of rattlesnake and wait for the diner's theatrical recoils. Afterward, everyone would laugh, and the town would have a new anecdote to trade for weeks. Stew, which we've already visited, is the place where most of these meats met their culinary fate. If the stew pot had a reputation, it was for absorbing scraps without asking questions. A cook who respected the pot, meaning one who fed it steady, hot heat, kept its water fresh enough, and steered clear of obviously spoiled bits, could feed a room of hungry men and perhaps get them to call him chef with a wink. The stew's virtue was its ability to turn chew into palate, toughness into comfort. Long simmering softened gristle and salt and fat combined to suspend the flavors so they melted together into something borrowers of dignity could swallow with a grin. Now we should talk about something cooks loved and feared in equal measure: rendered animal fat. That brown viscous gold was the kitchen's currency. Whether it began as salt pork, a bit of beef trimmings, or drippings from a roast, fat was melted down and saved in crocks near the stove. It fried potatoes, greased skillets, and found its way into biscuit dough to make it tender. A cook would sometimes reuse fat until it tasted of the kitchen itself, a shorthand for "this place has a history." That accumulative flavor is delicious to some and decidedly off-putting to others. It's an example of frontier thrift that modern palates may struggle with. Reusing fat was practical in a world where lard was a valuable commodity and new supplies were not always at the back door. It was frugality elevated to the level of survival. Reusing fat also became a social marker.
If you were a regular who left a generous coin, you might find a slightly fresher piece of meat on your plate. The favored patron tasted the difference.
The non-favored accepted the communal coat of flavor. The cook's decisions, who got the crisped edge of the salt pork and who got the soft stew meat, mapped out an informal hierarchy. In that way, food was more than calories. It was a social ledger. Pickles and preserves deserve more than a passing mention because they represent the frontier's knowledge of holding time at bay. Jars of cucumbers, walnuts, beets, and onions in brine were love letters from summer to winter. Where fresh vegetables were seasonal and often adulterated on the road, a jar of pickled goods added brightness to a monotonous diet. Molasses was another preservative and a caloric shortcut. It was cheaper than refined sugar and more available in some places, so it became the common sweetener. Slather it on cornbread and you have a dessert that sticks to your ribs. Cheese, usually hard and long-aged, functions similarly. A wheel of cheese could ride a wagon for weeks if wrapped right, and its salt and firm texture kept it from spoiling quickly. In saloons, a chunk of cheese might be sliced into a biscuit or served with pickles for a semblance of variety. These were not delicacies in the modern sense, they were practical ways to make the available larder feel larger. Let's talk about bread and its dramatic alternatives one more time, because bread says a lot about what a community values. A cooked biscuit, the flaky kind that collapses under a pat of butter and shakes crumbs like confetti, could make a whole room notice. That rare success indicated both skill and supply. Fresh flour, enough fat, a steady oven. Hardtack, by contrast, made no pretense. It was flour and water baked to near immortality. Soldiers learned to hate and respect it. At a saloon, you would rarely see people celebrate hardtack. It was sold as pragmatic fuel. People softened it with coffee, crumbled it into stew, or used it to anchor a particularly thin meal. A man who showed up at the saloon with a bundle of hardtack might be poor in coin but fortressed against hunger. These distinctions, biscuit versus hardtack, fresh steak versus jerky, were also geographic. A mountain mining camp with access to foraged roots and game tasted different from a plains town where beef was central. Salt and sugar availability, trade routes, and the season could flip a menu overnight. A flood of cattle through a town could mean a week of fresher meat. A late winter freeze could reduce a saloon's offerings to tins and barrels. Now, kitchen dynamics and etiquette. The cook controls the back room like any sovereign. That back room could be a battered wood stove tucked behind the bar, or it could be a slightly more elaborate arrangement in a town with a reliable supply chain. Fuel ran the gamut, wood where forests were near, coal in more developed settlements, and sometimes whatever scrap burned predictably when nothing else would. The cook had to manage the fire and the clock. Long, low heat made stew. Quick, hot flames charred pork into crispness. If you wanted a rare steak, you needed a cook willing to flout prudence. If you wanted a solid bowl of stew, you needed patience and a cook who could maintain a simmer for hours. Cooks were often itinerant or immigrants, bringing culinary habits from other places and adapting them to what the frontier offered. In some towns, women ran boarding house-cum kitchens that served miners at breakfast and families at supper. In others, a solitary man with a temper and a skillet ran the show. The cook's reputation mattered. A rumor of poor sanitation could empty a bar faster than a sheriff's order. But reputation built slowly. A cook who saved a hungry man a portion during lean times earned loyalty that money could not buy. The cook's moral economy, who to feed for free, who to favor for a price, mattered as much as the recipe. Hygiene is one of those subjects where modern sensibilities meet historical realities, and neither side is innocent of misunderstanding. Frontier kitchens rarely matched an urban Victorian's notion of cleanliness, and by modern standards, many of the practices were risky. But you have to understand the reasoning. Preserving food meant salting, smoking, pickling, all sensible measures, given the lack of refrigeration. Heating food thoroughly and serving it hot reduced some risk. Yet storage practices,
Fly presence, cross-contamination between raw and cooked foods, and intermittent supply lines created hazards we'd rather avoid today. People accepted these hazards because their alternatives, going without food or spending precious coin, were worse. That trade-off is a central moral of dining on the frontier. You ate in order to live, and you accepted the attendant peril. Socially, saloon meals oscillated between egalitarian and hierarchical. On the one hand, that communal bowl of stew was democratic. Whoever showed up and accepted a spoon could eat. On the other hand, money and influence bent the rules. A wealthy rancher might insist on a tender cut, and get it. A favored regular might be first for the fresh biscuit. This dual nature, communal necessity versus private privilege, gave saloon food its human friction. It also generated stories and grudges. A man who felt slighted might tell his tale loud enough for the room to judge. Humor and insult functioned as social regulation. Speaking of stories, let's unpack a few more that sit at the border of history and folklore. Earlier, I mentioned the bean for horse yarn. Legend has it that someone once traded a barrel of beans for a horse. Mark that as legend. Entertaining, telling about staple value, not verified transaction history. Another frequent yarn involves the stewpot relics, the bootlace, the forgotten coin, the mysterious bone. These stories emphasize narrative texture, not culinary fact. They tell us what the community worried about and laughed at. That is as important as any ledger.
There's also etiquette around drinks worth dwelling on. Cowboy coffee, as we've said, was thick and brisk. You drank it fast and often. Coffee breaks punctuated the day, before a shift, between tasks, and after Sunday sermons in some towns where people sought a second wind. A tin cup of coffee meant civility. It also signaled survivalism. And whiskey, pouring a shot was more than a transaction. It marked a moment. A barkeep might slide a shot to an old friend for free. A gambler might pay to steady his nerve. A man in mourning might drown his memories for a time. Whiskey lubricated speech, encouraged honesty and lies in equal measure, and became a social hinge on which many conversations swung. But let's not romanticize. The same whiskey that made a man courageous could wreck him. Where moonshine or poorly distilled spirits were common, the line between a courageous nip and a crippling habit was thin. Saloons both sustained and consumed communities. That paradox tastes bittersweet when you look at it up close. We should also note the seasonal rhythms. Harvest and slaughter cycles influenced menus. Fall and early winter meant preserved meats, pickled jars, and new lard in the crocks. Spring and summer offered game, fresh eggs, and the rare garden lettuce. These seasonal patterns meant that the saloon menu was never static. It changed with the land's generosity and the town's luck. Let's take a brief detour into the world of desserts and what passed for them. Cornbread with molasses was the common treat, dense and sweet enough to stick to your teeth. In towns where sugar was more available or the cook had a patient hand, pies arrived. Fruit pies when fruit could be had, mince pies in winter, and occasional sweet pastries. Pies were celebrations. A good pie could tip a day into a festival. They were also markers. You'd know you were in a saloon where someone cared about making a pie. If a cook took time to make an apple pie, it meant they were staking a claim to reputation. For many, the palate trained on frontier fare acquired a particular toughness. People learned to appreciate simple, high-flavor notes: salty, smoky, and fatty. Bread soaked in broth and eaten with jerky was not an affront. It was a way to make less into more. If you'd grown up with that menu, you could evaluate a cook's worth by the crust on a biscuit or the smokiness of a jerky piece. Taste became a measure of endurance and community. Now approach the social economics of barter and credit, food as currency. A bartered sack of beans could be the difference between a hungry week and a full belly. People traded services for plates. A man might sing for his supper, repair the barkeep's saddle for a plate of stew, or play piano in exchange for whiskey. Credit ran on trust and reputation. A good reputation could mean a tab at the bar. A knock to one's reputation could close that tab's door. Food and credit were woven into community bonds. The saloon was also a place of labor negotiation.
Miners, drovers, and laborers used the saloon as an informal marketplace. Word of wages, jobs, and prospects traveled over plates. The cook, the barkeep, and the piano player were nodes in that network. If you wanted work, you asked over coffee. If a man was known to do honest labor, he had some claim to a warm bowl. And there was the gendered texture of dining. In many places, saloons were male-dominated spaces, where men ate and drank, talked loudly, and found refuge. In other towns, women ran boarding houses and kitchens, and served community needs with a different, quieter authority. Women cooks often fed whole families as well as miners, and their hands controlled more domestic economies than the saloon acknowledged. The frontier's gender realities were diverse and nuanced. It's important to remember that not every kitchen was a man's domain. Let me tell you a small, emblematic anecdote that helps tie these strands together. It's commonly reported in frontier recollections. Label it commonly reported rather than strictly verified. That in a boom town, a widowed boarding house cook kept miners fed through a winter by discreetly adding rendered fat and a bit of powdered dried meat to her soups. Her small camp became the town's rumor center. Men who ate there said they always left warmer in body and story. She was rewarded not only with coin, but with loyalty and tips. Extra tobacco, a mule to borrow, or a sack of flour. That image sums up what food meant: survival, network, reciprocity. By now, you may be asking, how would a modern palate handle this? Would you survive a night in a saloon on their fare, or would you collapse at the first bowl of reused fat? The answer depends less on taste and more on tolerance. If your goal is culinary pleasure, the Frontier's menu will challenge you. It prizes function over finesse. If your need is calories and social warmth, it will satisfy in its way. Taste adapts quickly when faced with necessity. People who lived in those towns came to love the foods they had because those foods meant life. That's an emotional context modern culinary critics sometimes miss. Now for a moment of theater. Imagine a late winter evening. The wind is a sharp thing outside. Coal smoke crawls through the chimney. Inside, someone bangs a glass for silence. A new pot is stirred, and a favored regular gets a slightly nicer cut pushed his way. The cook wipes a hand on an apron and smiles, not kindly, but with recognition. A young drifter, new to town, watches the exchange. He learns quickly where he will get his next meal: anonymity at the stew pot or patronage at the bar. In that room, food is education. You learn where the biscuit jar lives, which corner has less dust, and how to ask for a second cup of coffee without appearing greedy. That education is practical and social.
Before we reach the close, we should touch on the sensory punctuation marks that make saloon meals cinematic. The crackle of salt pork hitting a hot skillet, the shush of a ladle against an iron pot, the low hiss of coffee poured into a tin mug, the clink of coins on a rough counter. These small sounds tell the story as much as any phrase. When you imagine a saloon, include the soundscape as part of the menu. Finally, let's bring this back to the question in the title. Wild West Secrets. What did they really eat at saloons? The honest answer is, whatever kept them alive, warmed them, and let stories be told. Beans, salt pork, stew, jerky, cornbread with molasses, hardtack soaked in coffee, the occasional fresh steak, these were the backstage essentials. Saloons were places where thrift met appetite, and where food confirmed belonging in a way coin could not. They were pragmatic, creative, sometimes messy kitchens that served a community more than a palate. Would you eat it? Would your modern taste buds endure the reused fat and the smoky jerky, the sometimes mysterious stew, the hardtack softened in coffee? Maybe. For a night, many of us would manage. But eating at a saloon meant more than consumption. It meant participating in a communal economy of survival and story. The bowl you accepted tied you to the room's laughter and gossip, to the cook's small politics, and to the frontier's raw need.
Picture one last image. A tin plate with a few stubborn beans at the rim, a smear of fat where salt pork has been spooned, a slosh of whiskey close enough to catch any spill, and a piano in the corner trilling the end of a tune as if to remind everyone that for all the roughness, life here had music. A man leans forward and scrapes the last bean with the back of his spoon. He lifts it to his mouth, tastes, and smiles in a way that says he would do it again tomorrow. Which saloon item would you try first? The beans, the salt pork, the stew, or the jerky? Tell me in the comments below. I want to know which frontier flavor you dare to taste.